Hi everybody, welcome. My name is Shafik Yaghmour. I am a Clang front-end developer at Intel supporting C++. I'm also on the C++ standards committee, mostly working in the core working group. You may also know me from my weekly C++ quizzes on social media. You may know me from my blog, which I post about 4 times a year, mostly on C++, edge cases, sometimes LLVM and general software development. You may also know me from my C++ dad jokes. I have one here for you today, and if you like them more, you can try to follow me on social media. So 8 bytes walk into a bar. Bartender asks, "What can I make you?" They say, "Make us a double." Okay, so thank you for the generous applause. So we are here today to talk about a UB and IFNDR annex for C++. So UB stands for undefined behavior. Undefined behavior is it's bad code, right? It's basically the standard says the behavior of this code, you have no expectations, right? An optimizer is going to assume you don't do code like this, and it's going to optimize accordingly. And this is when bad things happen. Security issues happen. All-night debugging sessions trying to figure out why your server is crashing. All around, just a bad thing for everybody. IFNDR stands for ill-formed, no diagnostic required. So the ill-formed part, in the standard, when we have ill-formed code, this means that it requires a diagnostic. So the NDR part here, this is code in which we'd like it to be ill-formed, but for technical reasons, right, the implementations may not be able to reliably diagnose it. And so you can end up with lots of scenarios here. The code compiles, it doesn't compile. It may compile on some implementations, it may not compile on others. It may have different behavior on different implementations, right? So it doesn't have this kind of unbounded runtime bad behavior that UB has, but in general, it is undesired behavior. It's not something that a lot of C++ developers understand very well, and so it's just a trap. So I'm gonna often kind of just say UB when I mean both, and so I'm just kind of using it as a shortcut. Okay. Yeah, so let's talk about the problem at a high level, right? So the C++ standard has a lot of undefined behavior in IFNDR. The next problem is that they're often very hard to identify. So if we look at this list here, right, just for undefined behavior, the standards document is a 2,600-page document, right? And so we can talk about undefined behavior as the behavior of the program is undefined. Undefined behavior, the behavior is undefined, the behavior, a bunch of other words, is undefined, and we can kind of go on, right? And you can sit there and say, well, why don't we just look for the word undefined? And unfortunately, we use undefined in lots of other contexts that have nothing to do with undefined behavior. So, if you want to find all the UB and IFNDR, you have to go through the whole document and kind of find them one by one. It's a tedious, long process. I've done it. It takes a long time. The next problem is they're often hard to understand. The standards document is not a tutorial. It is a specification. The language is often very dense, okay? There are usually no examples, right? Sometimes there are, sometimes there are not. It's not consistent. And so if you don't get it, you don't understand the undefined behavior of IFNDR, you're on your own. Lastly, the other problem is that sometimes UB is left implicit, right? So the standards specification, it sets guidelines and rules for what conforming code is, and sometimes when you break those rules, it's UB. Often the standard will explicitly point it out, but sometimes it doesn't. So you say, okay, at least we could just kind of go through the standard. Let's unify the wording. Let's get everything kind of clean and simple. And that might be a great thing, but it doesn't solve the problem, right? Because the standard is not a tutorial. And so you still don't have a way of understanding that UB, right? It's not put in layperson's terms, and we don't have a good place to put examples of it, right? And honestly, we would like to just have one place where all the UB and all the IFNDR is listed, so you can just see it all at once instead of having to search through this 2,600+ page document. So what is the annex, you might ask? So the ISO IEC directives part 2 actually gives us a really nice description, right? So the C++ standards committee is an ISO committee, often called WG21. it has lots of documents, how you run the standards body, and how you write standards, right? So it tells us, right, that annexes are used to provide additional information to the main body of the document and are developed for several reasons, right? Often when the information is just too verbose, it would kind of be out of place in the main body of the document, to set apart special types of information, or to present information regarding a particular application of document. So this kind of sounds like what we want. We want a place to list all the UB, all the IFNDR, with layperson explanations and examples, right? And just to clarify, we often hear in the standards terminology normative and informative, right? So normative are rules. You have to follow those rules. Whenever you see these words in the standard, right, that means that you have to follow them. Informative, often we have notes in the standard. They're not rules, they're just there to guide further understanding. So what are the high-level goals here, right? So the first goal is to create an informative annex for UB, to create an informative annex for IFNDR with plain explanations for each example and a code sample for each one. And we want two separate documents, basically because they're different things, right? IFNDR and UB, even though they kind of have the same property, they're unintuitive and they're kind of traps that developers fall into, but they're different things and we don't want to lump them all together. Another goal is that we have a lot of different target audiences, right? We have regular C++ developers. It could be college students. It could be professionals who've been doing this for a long time, who want to understand what UB is. They want to avoid these traps. They want to learn, right? And then we have the trainers, right? Trainers could be in-house trainers, people companies pay for to come in and train people, professors in college, presenters at C++ conferences or other conferences, right? They want the material to be able to explain UB, IFNDR, have good examples, and be able to teach people what to avoid, right? Tools developers, that's us, right? So we write tools, right? We write sanitizers, we write static analysis tools, we write diagnostics. And so we can look at this as a list of targets, right? So are we catching things, everything that we can catch? Are we diagnosing them better? Are we catching them as sanitizers, right? And so for tools developers, we want this nice list in which you can just go to and sit there and say, hey, listen, what could we be doing a better job with? And obviously then also for security analysts, right? So UB often ends up with security vulnerabilities. This is, news stories about this in the tech news all the time. And so we want security analysts to be able to have a list to look at and to be able to understand undefined behavior, to be able to explain it to their users, to be able to teach their users, just to be able to write better tools for catching and diagnosing undefined behavior. Another goal is we want to diagnose all explicit UB, right? It doesn't help if we leave anything out, so it has to be a complete listing of all of them. We are purposely not documenting implicit UB because it could be error prone. Because it's implicit, we may not understand the intent of how those words were written, right? And so maybe we might make that UB too narrow, or we may make it too wide, right? And so we want a separate process in which we now have to go and sit there and say, okay, we have implicit UB, we need to make it explicit so that then we can document it in the annex. And finally, we want to make sure that the WG21 process for writing proposals includes adding and removing UB and IFNDR from the annexes, right? So whenever you write a proposal to change things in the standard, right, you have wording, right, that you put into the standard to sit there and specify what you're doing, right? And so we want to make sure that that's explicitly part of the process of writing a proposal. So we may ask, why is this important for C++? I think not surprisingly, our users want a safer language, right? And as I go on and explain it, we can kind of see how this will help us eventually get to a safer language, right? UB is a trap for unaware developers, right? If you don't know what to avoid, you don't know what the UBs are and IFNDRs, you can't avoid them. And in general, we found that most C++ developers don't understand UB very well. They may have heard of it, they may have known some examples, but they don't really know the full space of it. I'm gonna be honest, experts often can't easily identify UB. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a chat or in a group or in a meeting in which you sit there and we're looking at this code and say, is that UB? Well, I don't know, maybe, right? And so even experts, we also need this documentation to help us better identify and learn about UB. It's also important because a common set of examples to make UB more concrete helps us to understand. So you can describe the various undefined behaviors, but sometimes seeing the code really brings it home. And so when you see the code, somebody sit there and say, oh, wait a second, I've seen that code before. Maybe I've done that code, right? And so it's important to be able to see examples. And lastly, if we don't document it, we don't know if it's getting better, right? So ideally, over the long term, we would like to see the undefined behavior in the standard decrease, right? But if we're not tracking it, we're not documenting it, we can't really tell. Another good question to ask is, why is it important for Clang? So unsurprisingly, our users want a safer language, right? Often, our users are going to write bug reports, have discussions, ask us questions. This optimization is doing something wrong, right? Or they don't understand why it's optimizing this way, and often they come down to UB. And so having a list, one place that lists all the UB and describes them well will allow us to communicate better to our users more effectively. And we'll be able to sit there and say, hey, listen, here's UB. This is what it is, and this is what you need to avoid. As tools writers, it gives us a list of targets to write better tools, to write better diagnostics, and to write extensions, hopefully to make it easier to avoid undefined behavior. We can move faster to implement solutions, right? We already have a lot of safe extensions, right? Some examples here, FWrapV, no strict aliasing, libc++ hardening. I'm going to point out that Aaron, Eric, Vlad, Coritan, and I, we have an RFC for a hardening mode in Clang. We would hope that this would kind of be like an umbrella area in which we can help develop more safer code options for Clang. So if you haven't seen this RFC, if you haven't commented on it, I would check it out and just add comments or just read it and understand it better. I'd like to talk a little bit about the process, right? So maybe if you haven't been involved in the standards committee, you don't know what the standards committee is about, how do you make changes, right? So in general, you want to make a change to the C++ standard, you're going to have to write a proposal, right? So my first attempt at this was P1705, right? You're going to write a proposal, and then in general, right? So you're going to have the standards committee is made up of lots of subcommittees. My targets are mostly evolution and core. Evolution deals with evolutionary changes to the language. You want to add features, you want to take away features, you want to enhance things. Evolution is where you get targeted, so the annexes were considered evolutionary change to the standards document, and the core working group deals with the wording in the standard, right? So when you implement things, you have to change the standard, the wording, and the core working group makes sure that the changes to the wording actually deliver the intent of the changes, right? And it works and the specification is correct. Often your proposals don't survive first contact with the committee. Often you may have to refine things and add new complete, specify things more clearly, right? And so that was my second proposal in this area, which is P3075. Eventually you get accepted, and then we're at this step here, which is iterate over annex wording, right? So we have a PR against the C++ draft standard currently, in which we have, I believe, is a complete list of UB and IFNDR, and so we're kind of at the point where we're just wordsmithing. And so then, then after once that's done and we sit there and we say, listen, we got this in the right shape, then we get a final acceptance of the wording, and then we can then merge that into the draft standard, and then we're done, at least with that point of the process. So I'd like to finish up with a call to action. The annex could use more editors, right? We're kind of, I believe, in a really good state where we have a full list of UB and IFNDR, but we need a lot of just wordsmithing, maybe better examples, et cetera. So we could use more help in trying to get that there. We need people to help us identify implicit UB in the standard, right? We know it's there. I haven't really sat down and tried to take a look at it and figure out what they are, but we need people to kind of, either if you're not in a committee, file defect reports. If you're already in W21, then you can just kind of start conversations in a core reflector, but we do need to start that process, right? So we can kind of turn those implicit UBs into explicit UBs, right? And hopefully remove all the implicit UBs. And then finally, I'd like to say that we need to be the change that we want to see, right? So we, as implementers and the tool designers, right, we can implement new diagnostics, help specify the behaviors of UB, right? Often, there's UB, we sit there and say, yes, okay, that's expected. What you're doing is undefined behavior, but sometimes the behavior can be pretty bonkers, right? And so we can maybe do a better job in trying to restrict how crazy we get with the optimizations, right? And hopefully maybe with extensions or other ways eliminate UB in general. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm open to them.
Thank you very much for this great talk. I completely support this. Undefined behavior is a wild field, and there's a MISRA rule say you should not have undefined behavior, but they don't know how to test it, and there's not even a specification, a clear one, and that's why I think it's very good. I have a question. How would you approach this list? You mentioned you went through the standard and then found everything listed there. Is this the way, or do you have other ideas to, let's say,
so you have to manually go through the standard, find all of them, right? I missed some, right? So Timur and other people have added ones that I missed, because when I started and then by the time I got it together, new UBs were specified and stuff like that. So it's 2,600 pages, right? The wording is not uniform across the standard, so you just have to.
You missed that there's some words can be separated, like /next line defined.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's a painstaking process. But once we have the annex, then we shouldn't have to do that anymore, right? Yeah. So we're one and done, and that should be it.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
I thought there might be also some experts that have some tools, checker analysis tools that say, okay, we have already some lists here.
We do, right? So we have sanitizers, we have static analysis, right? But I mean, I don't think we have anything that catches all forms. And maybe there are some you just can't easily catch, right? But I think we could do a better job. I think there are holes where we can improve.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So there's undefined behavior that is sometimes used as an extension point for compilers.
Yes.
Does this annex make a distinction between undefined behavior that is, we simply can't define this, versus this is intentionally undefined behavior because we want to extend?
No. It just basically explains it in layperson's term and gives you examples of them. It doesn't explain intent. It doesn't explain uses, right? We potentially could have a TS, right, in which we kind of go into more details. We go into what tools can you use to check it and stuff like that. I haven't started that process. I don't think anybody else has started that process, but I think that is an important process. This is just, okay, we need one place where we can find everything and we can educate people, right? And then now when you write proposals, we have to add them and remove them, and then we have to make it, I think, making an explicit part of the process, right? I think you sit there and you're looking at a proposal and sit there and say, you're adding UB. Oh, okay, I didn't realize that. Why do you have to add UB? And I think hopefully that'll help a little bit in maybe reducing the UB or maybe getting some more pushback, right? So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I felt hurt when you mentioned, when you were characterizing C++ developers who don't know what undefined behavior is and where it might show up.
Yeah.
So thank you. And this is a novel effort. Also, although it's a long way off, have you thought about how C++ 26 contracts will maybe make this process more mechanical of finding out what even is undefined behavior in any given API?
I have not been involved in contracts, right? So one of my other team members at Intel, Tom Honorman, has actually been really focused on contracts. I have not been focused on it. And so I think there are people who definitely have very strong opinions on this, right? So I think, the contracts folks have thought about this. I have not really talked to them about this in detail, so I'm not sure, right? I mean, yes, I think there are strong ideas on this, right? But I don't know what the contracts folks are saying in this area. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Hi, so I had a question that was basically, so like at the end we had the kind of call to action and the idea is we need more people to sort of pore over the documents to figure out what is UB in order to improve the annex. Do you see sort of a chicken and egg problem there where, in order to create the annex, you have to understand what UB is, but in order to understand what UB is, you kind of have to have an annex of what UB is. Like, what would be the process to bring people up to capability?
So my call to action kind of is targeting different people, right? So editors, right? Like if we want editors to edit, you don't have to be an expert, right? You could just be, let's say, like a really great at just being an editor in general, right? But yeah, the people who I'm asking to look and find implicit UB, those are more likely and not going to be experts, right? People who are already on the committee or people who are just really know a lot about C++. And so a regular C++ developer who's not really familiar with the standards document, probably they're not going to be the ones doing it, right? But I just want to make sure that there are going to be lots of C++ experts here, a bunch of people on the committee, right? And maybe they have ideas. Maybe there's somebody sitting there and saying, oh yeah, actually I've thought about this, looked at them, and I just haven't thought about them in a while. And they just fire off an email to the core reflector and start the conversation, right? And they don't even have to do much, right? They just write the email and then core will kind of just take it from there, right? Because we do care about this. Yeah.
Yeah, me again. So sometimes it's also intended. So if you have, for example, the order in which arguments are evaluated, that can be from left to right or from right to left, and some
that's unspecified behavior. That's
and this is then implementation defined. So
yes.
I think these are terms that also should unspecified or then implementation defined.
Yes, those are separate. Those are separate things. So we do have implementation defined. Oh, I'm actually not sure in the C++, right? But they are separate ideas, right? So implementation defined behavior is not UB, right? And so that is a separate idea, and there's unspecified behavior, right? But so the thing is, right, is that implementation defined behavior can catch people off, but UB kind of has this unbounded effect, right? That implementation unspecified behavior doesn't have, right? And so
for portability, it's dangerous to have implementation.
But portability, yes, for sure, definitely, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's thank.
Last question. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. Do you have an example of implicit UB?
I do not. I have not dug into it. I don't have a good example for implicit UB. Yeah.
Yep. So let's thank Shafik for the great talk.